I was browsing eBay recently when I came across an interesting listing.
Now it might not look like much, but once this was an Alpa Rotocamera, a rare 360-degree panoramic camera from the early 80s. So it was listed as untested, but even considering that, the price was very low compared to others that have sold at auction over the years. And I ended up buying it for just over £300.
So it's arrived in this massive case, and in this video I'm going to try to get it into a working state and then try to take a photo with it.
So I'll start by opening up the case to see what we have. And as you can see, an interesting bunch of things. But first of all, this case is in very bad condition. It's been completely smashed at some point, and the lid doesn't want to lock open. You can see that most of the hinge there has just broken off the box. And I asked the seller about it, and apparently this happened before postage, while he was trying to open the box up. Apparently the lid had just rusted shut after many years in storage. But for now I'm just going to fix the lid in place with a clamp, and I'll have a think about whether or not the box is worth fixing. But we can now take a look at the contents of the case. So in the middle we have the camera, of course, which we'll take a closer look at in a minute. We have a printed sheet of instructions. Then there's this massive quick release plate for a tripod. And let me know if you recognise what tripod head this might be used for, because I really have no idea. It really is huge. And next we have this strange homemade looking object. Very interesting. So the main part will be the battery for the camera. And then there's the controller for the camera up here. And at some point the previous owner has taped them together. Now originally the battery pack and controller would have been separate and would have looked like this. So I'm guessing at some point the original battery pack failed, and then the previous owner swapped it out for this battery and decided to tape the controller to it. I guess just to keep everything together and maybe to protect the wiring a bit. And you can see there are two wires coming out of the battery. One will be for charging it via this big charger here, and the other wire will go to the camera. And I'll be very interested to see if this all still works. It does look like some things will definitely need replacing. For example, on this wire, you can see the outer jacket has just deteriorated completely, and the whole case is filled with little bits of it. So that will definitely need replacing. But moving on, the final thing in the case is this battery charger, a Panasonic NV-B30. Again, definitely not the original battery charger that came with the camera. I imagine it was probably swapped out at the same time the battery was. So that's everything in the case, and now let's take a closer look at the camera. And it is extremely heavy, so 7 kilograms or 16 pounds according to the brochure, and it feels extremely solid. But picking it up, I could also feel that it's very dirty, and partly that'll be just grime that's accumulated over the decades, but also a lot of the camera is covered in this nasty sticky residue, which seems strange. And I'm going to open up the back of the camera now to see how it looks inside. And you may have guessed this, but this top part of the camera rotates, hence the name Alpa Roto, which is how it takes full 360-degree photos. And to remove the back, I just undo this locking lever, turn this knob, and pull the whole thing off. And unfortunately it's not looking too good. So I think I found the source of the sticky substance that's coating a lot of the outside of the camera. There's this channel here at the bottom which is filled with this horrible sludge. And it's hard to believe, but this was once a ring of rubber, or some other similar material. And there's a picture of what the rubber ring would once have looked like when it was intact. It is unfortunately necessary if I want to take any pictures, so I will have to find a replacement for it. Also, you can see on this side of the camera the same sticky residue, so I suppose the camera has just been laying on its side for a couple of decades, and the deteriorated rubber gradually flowed over here, and some of it leaked out onto the outside. And looking now at the inside of the back I just removed, you can see it's even worse. The whole inside is extremely dirty. Every surface is coated with the old deteriorated rubber. You can see more of the sticky stuff over here, where the edge of the back meets the camera. And down there in the bottom right hand corner, you can see there's a large spot of corrosion or rust. So before I get on to testing any of the camera's functions, I'm just going to clean up all of the residue that I can. And I'm just using isopropyl alcohol and cotton buds, and it seems to be working fairly well. And so moving on to the really thick stuff in the camera itself, I'm just going to lay down some paper so there's not too much mess. And I'm just going to start by scraping off as much as I can, just using my fingers. And yeah, it is quite unpleasant stuff. And then I can just clean off any residue with the same isopropyl alcohol and cotton buds. And this rubber-filled channel runs right around the camera, by the way. It stays stationary while the camera part rotates around it. And so to clean the whole thing, whenever I finish cleaning one section, I can just rotate the base to access the next section. And then I clean the whole outside of the camera as well. And it really was very dirty, and cleaning everything did take quite a long time. But there we are, finally finished. And generally everything cleaned up very nicely. It's just in that one spot in the corner of the back where you can see there's still that little bit of corrosion or rust, but it's not really an issue and it won't affect the functioning of the camera at all. And one interesting thing, you can see the serial number of the camera there, 0318, which is also on the camera itself. And as it's such a low number, it seems likely that not very many of these cameras were ever made. Now, I was a bit nervous about the cleaning of the lens, so I left it till last. It seems like the camera wasn't stored in the best conditions, so I was concerned there'd be haze or fungus. But in the end, the glass was perfectly clear. There was just a lot of dirt on the front element, which was easily cleaned with a lens cleaning spray and a microfiber cloth. So that's the lens before cleaning and after. Those white spots you can see under the glass are nothing to worry about, by the way. Sometimes these spots appear over time on the anti-reflective paint inside lenses, but they don't affect optical performance. So now that the camera is clean, I'm going to do some initial tests and see if it works at all. So I'll need the battery charger, and as I said, it's not the original battery charger. It's a Panasonic NVB30 from the early 80s, and originally it would have powered this massive portable video cassette recorder. And then there's the combined battery pack and controller. And while the controller is original, the battery isn't. Again, it was made by Panasonic in the early 80s, and it would have originally powered an early 80s Panasonic video camera. So I'm guessing the original battery and charger just stopped working at some point, and a previous owner just cobbled together this setup to keep the camera working, probably sometime in the 80s or 90s. Now I do have a copy of the original manual for the camera, but for this improvised charger and battery setup, luckily there is this printed sheet of basic instructions which came with the camera. I've covered up the contact info there, by the way. So firstly, you can see this sheet was printed in November 1998, and at the time the camera was owned by a camera rental place in the Orkney Islands. Very interesting, as there's this checklist for taking pictures on the side of the camera in French, which presumably means it was originally sold in a French-speaking country. So I wonder how it ended up in the Orkney Islands. But I'll move on now to actually testing the camera, and the instructions are quite straightforward. So I'll start by plugging in the charger, then plugging one end of this cable into the charger, and I can also switch the charger on, and then I plug the cable into the battery. And now the battery would be charging, but I'm sure it won't be holding a charge now after 40 years, so I plug the output of the battery straight into the camera. I can then switch the camera on, then press the rotation button on the controller, and nothing happens, which unfortunately means there is something wrong somewhere. Now, looking more closely at the charger for a moment, in addition to the output socket on the front, there's also this DC out wire on the back, and the printed instructions don't say which of these two outputs is supposed to charge the battery. So I'll try switching the cables over. They both have the same 4-pin DIN connector. And as soon as I connect it up, there's a popping sound from the charger. So obviously there's been a short circuit, and I'll just reset the circuit breaker there. So clearly the pin out of the cable on the back is wrong. So going back to the output on the front, and taking a closer look at this connector, it's actually very obvious what the problem was. You can see the blue wire there has just become completely disconnected. So I'll just quickly take it apart and solder that blue wire back into place. And it doesn't have to look too good. I'm planning on replacing all the wiring. I think every connector in the setup looks a bit dodgy. And I'll plug the cable back into the front of the charger, switch it on, and the 4-pin DIN connector goes back into the battery. And trying the rotation button on the controller one more time, we finally have rotation, which is a big relief to see. And I'm hoping there won't be any major issues with any of the camera's functions, and that I'll be able to get things to a point where I can start taking some pictures. So now that we've seen the camera's basic functions seem to be working, I'll now go into a bit more detail about how you're supposed to use the camera. So the first thing to know is that this isn't like a regular camera with shutter speeds, where you might use a short speed for light conditions and a longer speed for dark conditions. With the Alpa Roto, when I press the rotation button, in the same instant the camera's shutter opens and the camera starts rotating, and as long as you're holding down the rotation button, the camera will keep rotating and take one continuous image on a roll of film. So you can take a full 360-degree panorama, or just a smaller 90-degree one, or whatever you like. And so given there aren't regular shutter speeds, you might wonder how you vary the amount of light getting into the camera to account for different lighting conditions. And there are 3 ways you can do this. So firstly, the lens on the camera is actually just an off-the-shelf 75mm f6.8 Rodenstock Grandagon, and you can just adjust the aperture in the regular way. Now there's actually no way to adjust the focus of the lens, and so you're just supposed to stop the lens down until everything you want to be in focus is in focus. And there's a table in the manual you can use to check this. The second way to adjust exposure you can see if I open the back. So when the shutter's open, the image from the lens comes through this slit and onto the film. And by turning these knobs up here, you can control the width and the shape of the slit, which will change the amount of light getting through to the film. Now there are actually supposed to be 2 knobs here, but unfortunately one is missing. I did manage to track down an exact replacement, but unfortunately the only place that sells them won't post outside Germany unless I spend over €100. So I'll have to think about how I'm going to get one. But for now it's not too much of an issue. Now the left-hand knob goes from 1 to 4 and controls the width of the slit. You can see how the width of the slit changes as I turn the knob, while the right-hand knob goes from 5 to 7 and adds a tiny slant to the shape of the slit. Now the right-hand knob only makes a very subtle change, which is hard to see, but if I put the back on for a second, you can see it's covered in these different diagrams and tables. And at the top left, it has a diagram there for the different settings of the right-hand knob. So 5 is the default setting where the slits are parallel, 6 makes the slit wider at the top and slimmer at the bottom, while 7 does the opposite. So if you wanted to give less exposure to a bright sky, for example, you could turn the right-hand knob to the 7 mark, which makes the slit slightly slimmer at the top, and so it would give the sky less exposure compared to the rest of the frame. So hopefully that makes some sense. And there's one final way to adjust the exposure, which is simply changing the speed at which the camera rotates, which is what this switch here does. A is fast and B is slow. So I'll now demonstrate how I would set up the camera for taking a picture, and you use this table here on the right. And so imagine I'd taken a reading with my light meter, and I wanted, for example, a 125th of a second. I look at this table here, and it says that for the equivalent of a 125th of a second, I set the motor speed to A, I set the slit width to 3, and the second knob I can leave at 5. So I set the slit width and rotation speed, and then I'm ready to make an exposure. Now I decided to have a look at the internals of this part of the camera, mostly just to see if the perished rubber had caused any damage, and I just have to remove the knob and 2 screws. And it's very interesting. If you look, there's this little motor here connected by a piece of string to this flap, which is the shutter. And if I press the rotate button, the motor is triggered, it pulls the string, and the shutter opens. Looking more closely at this shutter flap though, you can see it's actually a mirror, which reflects onto a focusing screen set into the side of the camera, which means that this actually is an SLR. And I'm not aware of any other 360-degree panoramic SLRs. And actually, as the camera can take a single, infinitely long photo on a roll of film, you could probably call this camera the largest format SLR ever made. 6 by however long your roll of film is. Now the screen is a bit dim as the maximum aperture of the lens is 6.8, so we're in the garden now as it's a bit brighter. And you may ask what the point of the screen is if you can't even focus the lens. Well, this lever on the side of the lens actually moves the lens up and down, which you can see allows you to frame your shot vertically. And as you can imagine, this is quite an important feature, as when you're framing your shot, you can't tilt the camera up or down because the camera rotates while it's taking a picture, which unfortunately means the camera has to be perfectly level, or else your lens will be pointing up for half your panorama and then pointing down for the other half. Now there's one final feature to mention, which is the automatic rotation feature. So you switch from manual to auto here, then you're supposed to be able to use this ring to select how much you want the camera to rotate when taking a picture. And you can see marked on the ring 180 degrees there, 90 degrees there for example. Unfortunately for me though, the ring on my camera seems to be completely stuck. I'm assuming it's supposed to turn, although the instructions are a bit vague. I've decided not to try to fix it for now though. With the dead battery, the bad wiring, the deteriorated rubber ring, there are already enough issues to sort out for now. And shooting just on the manual mode, so the camera rotating as long as you're holding down the button, is perfectly fine. Let me know if you know what the issue might be though. Is this ring supposed to turn, or have I misunderstood the instructions? So I'll now talk a little bit about the history of 360-degree panoramic photography. So it really begins in 1787, when English painter Robert Barker coins the term panorama for his large cylindrical paintings. These panoramas were first exhibited in a specially designed building in London, offering viewers a complete, immersive 360-degree view. Barker's invention revolutionized visual representation of reality, and he was very successful. In the 19th century, the fad for painted panoramas was still going on, and when photography was invented in 1826, it was natural that panoramic photography would soon follow. The first photo panoramas were just made from photos from a regular camera stuck together. The first dedicated panoramic camera was Joseph Puchberger's 1843 hand-crank swing lens camera, which could capture 150 degrees of view. And then in 1857, the first true 360-degree camera was patented by M. Garrella of England, and it used a rotating clockwork mechanism. Now these cameras were really one-off experiments. It was only with cameras like the Circuit in 1900, which utilised Kodak's relatively new invention of flexible film, that 360-degree panoramic cameras really became accessible. Now a few decades into the 1900s, the popularity of panoramas seems to die off a bit, although panoramic cameras were still useful for certain applications, like photographing large groups of people. This was until the 1950s when smaller, cheaper, more convenient 35mm panoramic cameras, like the Krasnogorsks and wide Luxes, begin to appear. But these are so-called short rotation cameras, and would only capture 140 degrees of view, or less, nowhere near the full 360. And so this brings us to the development of the Alpa Rotocamera. So I was looking through some marketing material for the camera. You can see the original price in 1990, $9,000, and you can see there advertised below the camera and all its accessories, for some reason there's this book, Swiss Panorama by Emil Schultes. So I decided to purchase the book. It only cost me about £10, and it turns out it tells the story of the early development of my camera. So it all starts with the Swiss photographer Emil Schultes. In 1970 he was commissioned by Swiss Air to create a piece of work to be sold at the Swiss Pavilion at the World's Fair in Osaka, and he decided he wanted to make a 360-degree panorama of the Swiss mountains. So he climbed the Dufourspitz mountain in Switzerland, and using 3 wide Lux cameras pointed in different directions to make one full 360-degree image, he created this 360-degree panorama that he called Top of Switzerland, and it was a great success. He wanted to create even better panoramas of the Swiss landscape though, and decided the best way to do this would be to build a camera that could take 360-degree photos while hanging from a helicopter. And to do this he teamed up with a man called Hermann Seitz, owner of a camera repair business in Bern, but also a maker of rotating panoramic cameras. And these are just some of the panoramic cameras he created over the years. And after a long development process, they created this camera, which would go on to be the prototype for the Alpa Rotocamera. And I had been wondering why the camera was so heavy and built like a tank, and the explanation is that it was originally designed to be used hanging upside down from a helicopter. Now the rest of the book is filled with pictures Schultes took using his setup, and they really are extremely impressive. Now back to Hermann Seitz. He was commissioned to make some more of these cameras for NATO with his company, which is still going today and still making panoramic cameras. And then in 1981 the camera was made under license by the camera company Alpa as the Alpa Rotocamera 6070. And looking at some of the promo material for the camera, you get a sense of the sorts of people this camera was aimed at, and who might be willing to spend the equivalent of $20,000 on a panoramic camera. You can see it says there the camera should be interesting to professional photographers, architects, business users, industrialists, landscape designers, engineers, insurance companies, police, and armed forces. Okay, so I'm now going to make a start on the repairs I have to make to the camera before I can take any pictures, starting with the rubber ring that needs replacing. And to demonstrate what the ring is for, I'll load the camera with the backing paper from a roll of film, and loading is quite similar to other medium format cameras. The film goes in one side, and then just slot the end into the take-up spool. And with that done, I can put the back on the camera. I'll give the camera a spin. And looking at the film now, you can see the issue. The paper should be nicely wound up onto the spool on the left, but instead of that, it's all bunched up in the middle here. And you'll notice there's this little rubber wheel here, and if I spin it, it winds the paper onto the spool and gets rid of the slack. And if I line up the back with the camera, you can see this channel where there should be rubber lines up perfectly with the little rubber wheel. So there are two things going on here. What's supposed to happen is there's this upper rubber strip here, which for whatever reason is still intact. The film is pushed onto this, and then as the camera rotates, it's pulled from left to right. So this part is working fine. The issue is with the second part. So as the film moves across, gets exposed, it's supposed to be wound up into the take-up spool on the right. And it's this little rubber wheel that winds the exposed film onto the take-up spool and stops the film from just bunching up and jamming the camera. And the rubber wheel is supposed to be turned by a strip of rubber in this channel here, and which I have to replace. So hopefully all that makes sense. And for finding a replacement, all I have to go on is this one image of what the rubber originally looked like. I did contact both Alpa and Seitz, the two companies involved in making the camera, to ask if they had any idea what kind of rubber it was, but they didn't know what I was talking about. So I'll just try a few different materials and hopefully one works. First though, I need to find out the dimensions. So first the length I can find with just a piece of masking tape, which I'll wrap around the whole channel, and then I make a mark where the tape meets itself. And finding the depth of the material I needed was a bit more difficult, but you can see if I take a piece of blue tack and stick it in the channel, put the back on the camera, rotate the camera once by hand, the piece of blue tack now has a little channel, which the rubber wheel has pressed into it. And if we now measure the thickness of the blue tack at this point, we'll know how thick our replacement rubber needs to be, and it seems to be just under 3mm. So I've bought this rubber material on eBay, 10mm wide, 3mm thick, with adhesive on the back, and I'll cut a test strip, stick it in the channel, and see if the camera still runs. And the camera doesn't want to turn. It's just completely locked up. So I think the issue is that the rubber is just slightly too hard, and you can imagine the wheel wants to compress the rubber slightly as the camera turns, and the motor just isn't powerful enough. Now the next material I tried was some of this rubber sponge material, and you can see it's much softer than the rubber I tried before. So I tested it out, this time with a strip running the full length of the channel. But unfortunately I experienced the same issue again. The camera didn't want to turn. I then double checked the dimensions though. It turned out I'd been sent 4mm thick foam rather than the 3mm thick I'd ordered. So I ordered again, made sure it was actually 3mm thick this time, and it's the same process as before. And I decided to rough up the surface slightly, just to give it a bit more grip with the rubber wheel. And so applying it again, putting on the back, and the camera does rotate, which is a good sign. And taking off the back, you can see there's no slack in the paper, it's just getting nicely rolled onto the take-up spool on the left. So hopefully that's now fixed, and the film now won't jam the camera up while it's rotating. And now it's finally time to tackle the battery pack and cable. I've tested the battery and unsurprisingly it won't hold a charge at all, and the cable, although working, is in very poor condition. And by testing the cable with my multimeter on continuity mode, I've created this simple diagram. And basically in the whole setup what we have are three things: the controller, the camera, and the battery pack, all connected by a single cable. So I'm going to be putting together a new battery pack and a new cable. So I've acquired all the components I think I need. Everything together cost around £50, and I'll show you how it's going to work. So I'll be copying the original setup more or less. So a new 12 volt 1.2 amp hour battery like the original was, in an enclosure, and it will be charged via this standard DC plug and socket, using this cheap 12 volt battery charger. Power comes out via this 4-pin DIN socket, goes down this cable and into this 6-pin DIN plug, which connects to the camera. The controller I'll connect up via this 3-pin inline connector. Then there's this long cable, which means I can trigger the cable from reasonably far away if I want to. And signals from the controller then go into this plug here, then through the power cable and into the camera. So the first thing to do is separate the controller from the non-original dead battery. And I've been keen to do this ever since I got the camera. The whole thing is a bit of a mess. So that's the controller finally free. And I thought I'd just take a quick look inside, just out of interest. And you can see how surprisingly simple it is. Just a button and a switch. And so it'd be very easy to replicate if it was ever lost or broken. So after putting it back together, I'm just going to clean the controller and the cable a bit. And then I'm going to cut the cable so I can add that inline connector. And the reason I'm adding this inline connector is just that the controller is wired directly into the rest of the cable. And so cutting the cable and adding a connector means I don't have to open up the controller and desolder the connections to add a new wire. So it's just much simpler this way. And after I've done the female half of the connector, I'm also going to add a male half to the original wiring. And that just means I can plug the controller back into the original setup, just to check everything is still working. And yes, the rotate button still rotates the camera. So now I can get on to recreating this cable, and you can see how bad it looks. I'm actually surprised it's working at all. And I'm just double checking my wiring diagram with the multimeter, and everything seems right. So that's the diagram, and you can see it's fairly simple. The 3-pin connector to the controller here, the 6-pin DIN plug connecting to the camera here, and then a 4-pin DIN plug connecting to the battery pack. And I'm going to be using all these parts. So firstly, the 3-pin inline connector that will connect the new cable up to the controller. Very easy. Then the 4-pin DIN plug that goes to the battery pack. And this will be a little bit tricky as it's 2 cables going into one plug. So firstly I'm joining up the pins in the back of the plug that need to be joined, then soldering together the wires that need to be, and then soldering them into the plug. So that's done. and I just need to add the housing, and I'm adding a zip tie for extra strength. So that's the 4-pin DIN plug now done, and now there's just the 6-pin DIN plug that goes to the camera, and it's the same process as before. So that's the cable now finished, looking very nice, and for a test connecting it up to the camera, controller and battery, it looks like everything is still working, which is a big relief. So the final thing now is the battery pack. Now I found pictures of many different variations of the battery pack and charger online. For some reason Alpa never seemed to have made two the same, so I'm not going to be recreating any particular one. And I'll need the rest of my parts. Now I've marked out on this enclosure where I want my sockets to go. I've drilled the holes off camera and test fitting the sockets and battery. Everything seems to fit well in the enclosure. And again, testing with the multimeter, I've worked out a diagram for the wiring, and it's very simple. So there are the two sockets. One is charge in, the other power out. The two sockets are connected together at the back, and then to the battery. So I've got my charger here, and I'll start by cutting the spade connectors off, and soldering the charger to this standard DC plug. I then solder some short wires to the socket. These wires get connected up to the spade connectors, I cut off the charger, and then all this gets connected up to the 4-pin DIN socket. And with that done, we're ready for assembly. So the wiring goes through the hole for the DIN socket. I can secure the DIN socket, secure the charging socket, and connect the spade connectors up to the battery. So that's now finished, and luckily everything still fits into the enclosure. Now off camera I added some double-sided tape to the bottom of the battery to stop it from shifting about, and to finish it off I add the screws. Now one thing I noticed was this little disc stuck to the old battery and covered up with tape. You can see it's a little Alpa logo, and it seems to be the same one that was on this variation of the original battery pack. So I'm guessing when a previous owner threw out the original battery pack, they saved this disc and stuck it to their new battery. And I'm going to do the same thing. Very nice. So now a final test. Now I won't need the old battery or charger anymore. There's the new battery pack, its charger, and the cable, and it's now a much cleaner looking setup. So first I'll test the charger, plug it in here, and the red light shows the battery's charging. Very good. And now to test everything else. I disconnect the charger, and connecting up the new battery pack with the camera and controller. It all seems to work very well. And one thing I didn't expect is that the torque of the motor is much better than before. It seemed a little bit low on power with the old setup, but now I can hold the camera fairly tightly and it still turns fine. So perhaps the old battery was just not providing enough current. Moving on though, I'll just load some film into the camera, and one standard roll of 120 film will give me one full 360-degree photo, and so we should now be ready to take some pictures. Now unfortunately my first trial of the camera with film did not go too well. So this hill should have been a good spot for trying the camera, with nice panoramic views, but unfortunately it turned out to be very misty. Then after what seemed like one successful exposure, the film just started to jam in the camera, and it wasn't immediately clear why. I developed the one roll of film that seemed alright though, and this was the result. Not very promising. And this is one small section of the full image that I scanned. So there are two problems here. First, for some reason I didn't set the lens rise and fall properly, so most of the picture is just looking at the sky. Secondly, there have been some very obvious light leaks, and I trace this to the foam material I had used just being too fragile. If you look at the foam strip, you can see there's actually a channel that's been worn into it by the rubber wheel. after just a few uses. And this resulted in the first roll being too loosely wrapped up, like this. So after I took the film out of the camera, light could get onto the film from the top. And then it meant for subsequent photos, the film started jamming the camera. Now I've got some new rubber on order that I think will work much better, but for now I'm just going to put a fresh strip of the foam material in the camera, which I'm hoping will remain intact for at least one photo, and we can try again. Okay, so I've decided just to try to get a decent picture in the garden for now, and I'll save the more interesting subjects for later. Now I've stuck some Velcro on the back of the battery pack and on this tripod leg, and once I stick them together, I can add this Velcro strap, and that seems pretty secure. Now I plug the cable into the battery pack, into the camera, and into the controller. And I have to make sure the camera is as level as possible using the spirit level on the camera. And even though this is my most heavy duty tripod and head, the head is rated for a maximum of 7.5 kilograms, while the camera is 7.3. So I'm hoping it's going to be stable enough. So I'm going to frame my shot a bit now, just by adjusting the lens rise and fall. And I think something close to the middle position seems about right. I can now start taking some readings with my light meter. And I'm taking readings in all directions, and then just taking an average. And the meter's saying 1/15 of a second at f8. So I set the aperture on the lens to f8. Then looking at the 15th of a second row on the table, it indicates motor speed B, which we're already on, and the slits are set to 1 and 5. And so with that set, I then crouch down to get out of the view of the camera, and I can make the exposure. And I'm doing several full rotations of the camera, which should ensure firstly the film is wound on, then the whole roll of film is exposed in one continuous image, and then the film is fully wound onto the take-up spool. So that should be it. Hopefully we now have a decent image. So this time the film was wound nice and tightly onto the take-up spool, and after developing, the photo looks quite promising. So I scanned the film in sections, and then assembled the sections manually in Photoshop. And there is the result. And it's really quite impressive. The exposure is overall pretty good, although maybe slightly underexposed in some areas, and overexposed in others. But perhaps that's just inevitable with a 360-degree panorama. So the picture takes up one whole roll of HP5+, and it's about 6 by 50 centimeters. Now I only use black and white film for testing because it's cheaper and I can develop it myself, so I'm looking forward to putting some colour film in the camera. Now you can see this part of the photo here is slightly out of focus, and that's just because it was closest to the lens, and the lens is fixed focus and set to infinity. I was shooting at f8, so nearly wide open for this lens, and if it had been a brighter day and I'd been able to stop right down to f22 or 32, even the closest stuff would be in focus. But if I zoom in now to something that's really far away from the camera, you can see just how sharp the lens can get. Really very nice. So overall, I'm very happy with the photo, and I'm looking forward to taking some more.
So I finally completed a successful test of the camera with film, and that's where I'm going to leave the video for today. Now I'm planning on making more videos with the camera, so some colour photography perhaps. So subscribe if that's something you're interested in, and let me know what you think I should photograph. I also have a Patreon now where you can get updates on future projects, buy prints and that kind of thing. But that's about it for now. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.